quarters. So we'll sit up here, and if you want to kind of choose seats over on this way.
Hey, nice to see you again.
Come to the table, join us.
Yes, seats are on the table here.
We need women at the table. Need women at the table.
Hey, haven't seen you in a while.
You guys are still going to get the webcasting shot? We're going to get a shot. So do you have a link that we could? As soon as we have one, I'll let you know.
This is David. Yeah, I'm from the brand.
Let me know when you're all ready, Phil. Ready? You want to get the door? All right, thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. My name is Matt Duss. I'm the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. Before I introduce our two speakers, I just want to make a note of apology, as we had intended to have a lunch here, but we went to make arrangements yesterday. We found out to our shock and surprise that this was a no food room. So for those of you who came for the food, I've been to Washington enough. I've been one of those people. So if you feel the need to slink out of the room, we won't hold it against you. Or we could all get pizza or something afterward. There are lots of options over at Union Station. But anyway, thank you so much for joining us for the presentation and discussion of this report from Human Rights Watch. To my left is Saadoun. She's a researcher in the Business and Human Rights Division, the author of this report. And to her left is Lara Friedman, who's the Director of Policy and Government Relations for Americans for Peace Now, one of the real authorities on these issues here in Washington, who's on the Hill quite a bit. So I just want to set up the report a bit. Some of you may be familiar with it. Occupation Inc. looks at the impact of businesses in settlements and how these businesses both profit from, benefit from, and actually exacerbate human rights abuses in the occupied Bank. I'm just going to set it up that briefly and turn it over to Sarah to kind of talk about some of the key findings, and then we can go to Lara for some questions, and then we'd love to get to some questions from the audience. Sarah, please.
Hello, thanks, Matt. So yes, as Matt said, the report looks at businesses involved in or with Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Most of our recommendations are therefore directed at businesses themselves, but of course states, particularly the U.S. government, has an important role to play concerning these issues, particularly in light of the recent legislation, so-called anti-BDS measures, that actually would discourage or punish companies for implementing our recommendations because of the way in which they include and the territories under Israel's control in the frame. So Human Rights Watch works on business and human rights issues all over the world, and we apply the same framework that we apply globally to businesses operating in settlements in this report. Some of you might be familiar with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which were unanimously adopted by the Human Rights Council in 2011, which seek to kind of standardize what businesses' responsibilities are under international law. These standards have been widely accepted by states, including the United States, which is in the process of developing a national action plan to implement these standards.
He's right up here.
Thank you. Thanks.
And this is the framework that the report uses in one sentence. What it means is that what businesses have to do is they have to do due diligence throughout their entire supply chain to identify where they might be contributing to adverse human rights impacts, and then take measures to mitigate that impact. And so what this report does is it looks at businesses that are operating in settlements and asks the question of whether or not they're complying with these widely accepted standards. And what it concludes is that there is really no way of doing business in or with settlements without contributing to serious violations both of the laws of occupation, called international humanitarian law, and human rights abuses associated with settlements. The report looks at, it uses 5 case studies, including one American company, and looks at how they are contributing to different violations. It focuses on 3 major violations. The first is how businesses, by virtue of financing, servicing, and servicing settlements by paying taxes to settlement municipalities, by providing jobs to settlement employers, to settlers, are helping to sustain and expand settlements. So the idea being that now you have upwards of 500,000 settlers living in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and this would not be sustainable without this range of Israeli and international companies operating there. The second violation that the report looks at is the way in which these companies are contributing to Israel's unlawful confiscation of natural resources in the West Bank. So the laws of occupation make the natural resources in occupied territory subject to restrictions so that the occupying power can only use them for the benefit of the local population or for military necessity. This is a principle in international law that the United States government accepts. In fact, it's what was behind the reason for the 2003 occupation of Iraq. The coalition forces set up a fund, a development fund for Iraq, so that all the royalties of Iraqi oil would be used for the benefit of the Iraqi people. Actually, there's a memo from 1969, or around there, a U.S. State Department memo, basically laying out this principle with respect to Israeli oil fields Egyptian oil fields in the Sinai that came under Israeli control. And so this is a kind of a widely accepted principle under international law. But of course, in order to establish settlements, Israel has been confiscating large tracts of land in the West Bank under a whole variety, in a variety of ways, and then transferring them for settlement. In addition to settlements using water from the West Bank, settlement quarries extracting stone from the West Bank for the Israeli settlement markets. All of this in violation of international law. The third violation that the report looks at is a human rights violation, the way in which settlement businesses are benefiting from and entrenching a deeply, deeply discriminatory system where settlements are legally and physically segregated from Palestinians in Area C, and I brought along a map with me in case it's helpful. So Area C is the entire, the areas marked in green with the orange areas being built up settlements or settlement municipalities, and the dark red spots being the settlement industrial zones that Israel has established in Area C. All of this area is under exclusive Israeli administrative control, meaning that Palestinians need Israeli permission in order to build houses or extract natural resources. What the report describes is how settlement businesses have access very often to government subsidies, but also to building permits and licenses to extract natural resources that are all but denied to Palestinians. So in the year 2014, Israel issued only one single permit to a Palestinian to build in Area C of the West Bank, which is a statistic that was actually cited by Secretary of State John Kerry in the Saadoun Forum in December. Between the years 2000 and 2012, there was a 94% rejection rate for Palestinian permits in the Area C of the West Bank. But also, Israel bars Palestinians from opening new quarries in the West Bank. Stone production is an important aspect of the Palestinian economy. But since 1996, Israel has not issued a single license to a Palestinian to open a new quarry in Area C of the West Bank, even though under the Oslo Accords, Israel is supposed to consider such applications on their merits. All of this has the combined effect of Palestinians losing land to settlements, having inadequate access to water resources, not being able to receive building permits or licenses to extract natural resources, has a debilitating effect on the Palestinian economy. The World Bank in 2013 estimated that the cost of these restrictions to the Palestinian economy was $3.4 billion a year, which is equal to roughly a third of the Palestinian GDP. And I think that this is a particularly important aspect to focus on, primarily because the most common defense of settlement businesses is that they benefit Palestinians by providing them with jobs. Which is, in my view, a very, very cynical justification when the businesses themselves are operating on land that was unlawfully taken from Palestinians, are sustaining a system that is a source of numerous human rights violations of Palestinians, but also is benefiting from advantages, even though they are not lawfully allowed to be there, that are completely denied or virtually denied to Palestinians. And so if there is a genuine interest in helping the Palestinian economy, the way to do it is not by providing, at best, minimum wage jobs in settlements or in Israel, but by allowing for the development of the Palestinian economy by lifting these discriminatory restrictions and by reversing Israel's settlement policies. I will stop there, except to say that we have government-related recommendations, but our conclusion based on this analysis is that because businesses cannot mitigate their contribution to these abuses, because it's inherent in doing business with settlements, there's nothing that they can do about it. That is the basis for our call to businesses to end settlement-related activity.
Thank you, Sarah. Lara, just to put this in terms of policy making and things that are happening here on the Hill, our organization, FMEP, your organization, Americans for Peace Now, supports the two-state solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict. APN is the partner organization of Peace Now, Israel's largest pro-peace two-state organization. Put some of what Sarah is talking about in this report in the context of, what impact does this have on that broader goal of a two-state solution? What impact does it have toward our colleagues amongst Israelis and Palestinians who share that goal? And how do some of the measures being considered here in Congress impact that as well?
Sure, that's a lot. First of
So
all,
you can ignore any of that.
thank you all, and I'm happy to speak after Sarah because she has the hard part, which is presenting this really remarkable report, which you guys should all read and memorize, and then we will send you an email the test. I'm sure you've read it carefully. This report comes at a really interesting time. My organization here in the United States and Peace Now in Israel have been talking about settlements for decades. The settlement enterprise is not new. It started very shortly, almost immediately after the '67 war. And it really, for a long time, got very little attention. And people pay attention periodically, but it's really thought of in terms of a couple of houses on a hilltop, some trailers, some young enterprising pioneers who are out there. Maybe you agree with them, maybe you don't. But that isn't what it is, and that's not what it's been for a very long time. And what that means both for policy and for the prospects of a two-state solution is really profound. More and more people are talking about making the two-state solution credible and viable. And what they mean there is, can it be implemented on the ground? Not just physically, could we move enough houses or whatever, but is there going to be the political will amongst Israelis to do the hard things, because you're going to have to roll back a lot of what is now almost 50 years of settlements. And what this report points to is really how entrenched this is now. You don't just have isolated, built-up developments. You have an entrenched economy, which is now enmeshed with the economics, not just of Israel, but of international companies that are investing, possibly, mostly, without having any idea what they're doing. I think, when the Airbnb story came out, some of you may have seen this, I'm not sure Airbnb's management had any idea that they were listing homes in settlements, and some of them in illegal outposts. Those are settlements that are even illegal under international law. And suddenly they're the center of a giant international movement. I tend to doubt that Scarlett Johansson, when she agreed to be the spokesperson for SodaStream, knew that she was going to become the poster girl for settlement enterprise in the West Bank. But that's what happened. So this report, I think, lays bare another layer of how entrenched the occupation is, how far-reaching it is, and how much needs to be confronted in terms of our own, as individuals and politicians, in terms of understanding what it is and understanding what has to be rolled back. It comes at a very interesting time because more focus is being placed on settlements right now, in part because of things like the failure of the peace process. So we have years now of no progress for the two-state solution, and in response we see Europe and others saying, okay, we're going to start doubling down on what has been our policy all along, which is we support Israel, we don't support settlements, and now we're going to put more teeth into that. And in response to that, what we see here in Washington, which is an effort to say, if you support Israel, you support settlements. If you oppose settlements, then you're an enemy of Israel and an ally of BDS against Israel. And you define settlements in Israel as one and the same. So we're seeing really both unprecedented focus on settlements and differentiate between Israel and settlements, which is very healthy, I would say, and an unprecedented effort, unprecedented since any time since '67, to say not only are settlements okay, but they're indistinguishable from the body of Israel. They're part of the body of Israel, and if you support Israel, you must support settlements. So we're at a really, I keep saying interesting, I mean, I find it in some ways, energizing and terrifying. Some of the things that have come up in Congress, I've been doing this for many years. The idea that Congress is trying to use U.S. policy to legitimize settlements, I find quite shocking. And if any of you have been following this, that is the trend line right now. And it's happening in Washington, and it's happening at the state level. And, Sarah referenced it. We now see efforts to both discourage companies from differentiating between Israel and settlements the way this report suggests they should. And for those of us who read the tea leaves, Congress doesn't generally pass legislation making clear they don't like something unless they're later on going to try to, pass legislation to stop it. So there's reason to be concerned. Overall, as we're looking at the end of the Obama administration, the questions of what he may or may not do before the end of his term, the next administration, it is very clear for those of us who support the two-state solution, it is more and more challenging to make the case, looking at that map that Sarah held up, that there is a viable two-state solution today. That you could, and I make this point carefully when I'm asked, well, when will you declare the two-state solution dead? The fact is, when we say, is the two-state solution viable, we mean, if there were the political will of leaders today to come together and get to a two-state agreement, could we implement it on the ground quickly? Could it be implemented now with relative little difficulty? And the answer is, right now, it could be implemented. It'd be hard, but it'd be implementable. As things continue down this trend, it gets harder and harder. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you have to unwind more things. We can do it now, we can do it later. Depends how much bloodshed, how much unwinding you have to do now or later, because I believe there is another option. And that isn't because I'm ideologically committed to two states. It's because I don't see that there is any other option for ending this conflict. What this report points to is both the responsibility of the private sector in enabling the situation to get worse. And we're in an era where there is more and more concern about socially responsible business activity. There's more and more concern with what's happening in Europe about violating international law than we've ever had before. So I think this is a really important it puts a magnifying glass on something that's been happening for a very long time, and a lot of us have known about, but certainly not this level of detail. Thank you. And I mean, and it takes it beyond what, for example, is seen, my organization and Peace Now in Israel have for years called for boycotting settlement products, for boycotting the economy that enables settlements to be there. Not because, by the way, anyone believed it would dry up the settlements if you don't buy wine from Hebron, but as in making a statement, this is Israel, this is the settlements. When this is resolved, when I know what is Israeli and we have a peace agreement, I will buy Israeli products from wherever. But until then, I buy products from inside the Green Line. I don't buy products from across the Green Line, and that's what we call for. This is taking that a step further and making it clear if businesses don't want to do this, then they at least have to take responsibility for their role in taking us further from a two-state solution and further from ending the violence that is the occupation.
Thank you, Lara. Sarah, you lay out some broad legal concepts here, but you also do some really great case studies. Would you just walk us through one of those case studies, explaining how this actually works on the ground?
Sure. I will take a U.S. company. Before I want to make it clear, I imagine it's obvious that Human Rights Watch doesn't take political positions on what the outcome should be kind of the international law framework. But on the case study, so one of the companies we researched is Remax, which is the Colorado-based real estate franchise. Through a kind of series of franchise owners, there is a Remax operating in the Israeli settlement of Adunim, but also the branches inside of Israel are selling and renting property in settlements. And the settlement that we focused on is the settlement of Ariel, which is kind of in this region. One of the largest Israeli settlements has around 30,000 residents, 20,000 permanent and 10,000 students. And the branch inside of the Friedman Israel is renting and selling properties in Ariel. Now, to kind of walk you through the three violations that I described, firstly, it is facilitating in a very direct way the transfer of Israeli civilians into occupied territory in violation of international law. Its website actually markets these properties as they're in Israel. So it says Ariel Israel if you went to their website. It's the land on which the properties, the underlying land of these properties was also obtained in violation of international law. Most of Ariel is built on land that the Israeli military seized by an order in 1979 under security, ostensibly for security reasons, but then immediately transferred it for residential settlement. And now, of course, we have the separation barrier around Ariel, cutting off many hundreds of Palestinian farmers from their land. And I actually went to the villages surrounding Ariel and spoke to a lot of these farmers, and they described to me exactly in many cases they were able to actually quantify the financial impact of losing access to this farmland, the underlying land, to their livelihoods. And so Remax is profiting from and contributing to this loss of land. But it's also, I mean, these houses itself, these apartments itself, are presumably built with permission from the Israeli military, with a permit that Palestinians would not have access to. In this way, they are benefiting from this discriminatory system. Ironically, Palestinian residents in the West Bank would not be able to buy or rent these properties, even though they are built on land that, under international law, should belong to them. And so this is, yeah, one case study. Now, I'll add from a U.S. perspective, I mean, there is this kind of deeply deep inconsistency in the U.S. position, because on the one hand, the government's position is, first of all, that businesses should respect human rights, and the U.S. is developing a national action plan to help promote that. But also specifically in this context, that settlements are, at the very least, illegitimate. In the beginning, the U.S. was calling them illegal, but an obstacle to peace. And yet you have U.S. companies that are directly involved in helping to move Israeli settlers into, help move Israelis into settlements. If REMAX chose to actually implement our recommendations and pull out, that would actually be something that is now discouraged by U.S. federal legislation. So you have this very strange, wildly inconsistent position where, on the one hand, this is supposed to be something that businesses shouldn't do, that policies that the U.S. opposes, but on the other hand, Congress is actively protecting this business activity.
We'll just take a few questions now, if anyone has. Sir.
Well, as I read your report, it's pretty heavy. Oh, my name's Herbert Grossman. I'm a retired judge. And your report seems a little heavy on legal theory and international law. And the whole basis, apparently, of your report is the fact that Israel is occupying that land. And, of course, you don't cite any body that had jurisdiction over Israel to make that determination that that's an occupation. You refer basically to the International Court of Justice. But as you note, that's an advisory opinion. So I look to that opinion to see the principles of international law in which Israel would be considered an occupier, and I find that the court didn't even discuss that. Apparently it couldn't find any principles to support that position. All it did was list a number of entities that had called it an occupation and said that since they were called an occupation, we'll accept that. You look a little puzzled, so let me give you a specific paragraph citation. Paragraph 101 is where the court said, because all these other entities had said that, we'll accept that. And so, and they listed it in paragraphs 90 to 100. I think you're familiar with that.
Yes, I am, but sorry.
And so I looked at the history to see under what principles it would be considered to be Arab sovereignty that Israel is now occupying. And I see in the last 500 years, the only time the Arabs controlled that area was the 19 years in which Jordan had conquered the West Bank. You look puzzled, isn't that so?
No, the reason I look puzzled is, with all due respect, I mean, that's not the way in which to assess whether or not a territory is under military occupation, is not whether or not the ethnicity had historic...
Well, it has to belong to someone other than who was claimed to be an occupier for them to be occupied.
That's your contention. Why don't we let Sarah address the question?
So I'm happy to explain why we consider it to be under military occupation.
Well, if you just give me a few seconds, so I see, since Jordan took over that land at a time when it was held in trust for Israel, or for the Jewish people under the mandate and Article 80 of the UN Charter, why it would be considered Arab land when Jordan took it over. And if it were, why, when Israel, 19 years later, in a defensive war, took it back, it wouldn't be considered Israeli territory?
Okay, Judge Gershon, I think you can let her answer.
Yes, so the reason that it is considered under military occupation is because under the First Geneva Convention, which is the Article 2, which defines what's considered to be under military occupation, this territory would meet those criteria, which is that it's there are two ways in which a territory can come under occupation. One is that there's an armed conflict between two high contracting parties. Jordan and Israel are both high contracting parties. it ended in a military occupation, check mark. The other way is by what they call the kind of Sudetenland exception, which is that where a territory comes under occupation, regardless of whether or not it was preceded by an armed conflict. Those are the two ways in which a territory comes under military occupation. There was a war between two high contracting parties that ended in the Israeli military, the territory coming under the effective control of the Israeli military. In fact, the Israeli courts apply international military law.
Two things. One is when it becomes an occupation, and the second thing is what your rights are if there is an occupation. Now, what you are citing to me doesn't determine that there was an occupation. In order for there to be an occupation, some country has to take something that belongs to another country.
No.
What gave Jordan the sovereignty over, or the Arab sovereignty?
The Arabs is not a sovereign. I mean, Arab is an ethnicity, it's not a sovereign. So I think that the word Arab is a bit of a head herring. Jordan did not have sovereignty over the West Bank.
So
Jordan itself was an occupying power that occupied the West Bank for 19 years.
Occupied a land that was held in trust for the Jewish people under the mandate.
All right, I'm going to put a stop to it. Would everybody like to argue that climate change is an issue? Just two quick points. One is that Ariel Sharon, and thank you for your question, but I'm going to put a stop to it. Ariel Sharon himself referred to the territories occupied. He's not really a left-wing hippie. That was Ariel Sharon. I also note that the Israeli lawyer Theodore Marin, after the territory was occupied in 1967, the Israeli Foreign Ministry asked him to look at whether it would be permissible under Israel's legal obligations to create settlements in the occupied territory. He came back with the unequivocal no. I thank you for your thoughts. Any other questions? Tom, excuse me, sir. Thank you.
Let me ask you.
No. We're not going to have a debate, okay?
The Israeli High Court of Justice refers to the land as held under belligerent military occupation. That is the ruling of the Israeli High Court of Justice. Please, look it up.
Yeah, no,
So, I mean, if you look up the Israeli
Thank you, I
High Court of
appreciate it.
Justice.
Sir, we're going to move on. Tom.
This is not the Israeli High Court of Justice.
I'm asking for the legal principle under which that's considered an occupation.
I think that you have, with all due respect, I think you need to reread Article 2 of the Court's meeting convention, because I think that you're misunderstanding. If I can finish my thought. What it says is these laws apply in this situation. This in X, Y, and Z situation. That criteria clearly meets what's going the situation in West Bank. And the fact that every single impartial body has come to the same conclusion, including these Israeli High Court.
Well, you can believe in court. They didn't come to that. Every didn't.
All right, thank you, Tom.
Okay, I have a different kind of question, if I may. In your research, did you find... Oh, Tom New, retired, although I lived many years in West Bank and Gaza. In your research, do you find any example or case where a business working in the West Bank was so interconnected, legally and practically, with a business in Israel, that it becomes impossible or meaningless to distinguish between made in Israel and made in the West Bank? Because sometimes persons against BDS say, oh, it's also mixed together, how can we do it? But I'm saying, do you find any case where one cannot make that legal and practical distinction?
So I want to make it clear, firstly, the kinds of companies that are covered in this report are not only companies that are producing goods in the West Bank, but also, possibly more importantly, those that are providing services to and financing for settlements. Particularly in the second case, it's quite easy to distinguish. And companies that wanted to make sure that they are not providing services would just need to kind of establish limits on where they are willing to do business. We didn't do extensive research into the kind of flow of goods produced in settlements. I don't think it would be I don't think it would be particularly hard to do, because companies would just need to get verifiable reassurances from their suppliers that the goods are not in any part of the supply chain produced in settlements. and companies know where the goods are coming from. It's more an issue of transparency and due diligence. And that is I think, the kind of bigger obstacle, which is that because the government's position is not to differentiate, and because Israeli companies' position tends to be not to be transparent about their supply chains, that's where it becomes more difficult for companies. But this is not an issue that's unique to this problem. And companies around the world need to do due diligence about a whole range of things, and then they need to find ways to verify their supply chains. I don't think it is something that is unreasonably difficult to do, but I would be curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I would just add, this came up when we had with the legislation, the customs bill and the TPA bill, and one of the arguments that's been made, including by members of Congress, is, well, it's just too hard to tell where things are made. And I have to say, if that's the argument, then I don't know why we have point of origin requirements in any of our free trade agreements. It can be traced. It's a legal obligation under various free trade agreements between export regulations. This is our trade policy. The idea that we sort of suspend that trade policy when it comes to the West Bank, that's not going to be a question of we can't do it. It's going to be a question of we don't want to do it. It's certainly possible, and I for one, and I come from a pro-Israel organization, I don't like the idea. I push back against people who say, well, Israel should be held to a separate standard. I believe Israel is a country like any country. When people say, what about racism? Okay, I agree, I'm against racism, but don't look at home too. All these things are universal. The idea that on this, Israel gets to be held to a different standard in order to enable the occupation is as unacceptable to me as Israel should be held to a separate standard on things like whether it has a right to self-defense. Outrageous on both counts.
Sir.
Mike Kurtz, who worked for the Department of Agriculture, in fact, worked in some cooperation, economic cooperation, between Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and Jordan a number of 20 years ago. And I lived very close to the West Bank, in Chicago Shore for many years when I was a kid. The question I have, and this obviously to me quite a negative report, I'm not surprised. The question is, you said that Israel costs the West Bank so much money. My brother used to hire, as a farmer, 2 Palestinians from Gaza. Israel at that time pumped 3 million shekels a day into Gaza. How much money is being pumped into the West Bank now, and how many Palestinians are employed? You mentioned a soda stream, which may be made in the West Bank or not, could be made in China, so on. But I recall a report on 60 Minutes a year ago or so, where they said that most of the employees in soda stream, with the exception of a couple of managers and union managers, were Palestinians. And is that the case with most of these Israeli enterprises? Is Israel pumping more money into the West Bank? Maybe that's, it's an economic side of it. They're providing jobs, which most people in the Middle East do not have. That's another side of it. If I may just say, 55% of the educated women in Cairo and Egypt are unemployed, 40% of the educated men in Cairo and Egypt are unemployed. So these are jobs for these people. Outside of the political side, the bottom line is Israel has nobody to negotiate with. And I just may add one more. My friend Dan and I 2 weeks ago heard the mayor of Hebron speak over, I think Carnegie it was, and said there is no government in the West Bank. Abbas is now in the 12th year of his 4-year term, and probably has no power at all. It makes it very difficult for Israel to negotiate. Not that I agree with the settlers, that's another situation. But on the economic side, could you talk about that a little bit?
Thank you. Yeah, that is the most common question, really, about our recommendations. One of my favorite section in this report, if I can say that given that I wrote it, is the history of, it's very brief, but of Israeli economic policy vis-a-vis the West Bank. What I tried to show is that Palestinian dependence on Israeli jobs, on jobs both in Israel and in settlements, is not coincidental. It's actually an active part of Israeli policy. And there is another side to that coin, which is severely restricting the ability for the Palestinian economy to develop as a productive economy. And so, in order...
Can you give examples of that? The industries there?
Absolutely. So the quarrying industry is the case study that we use in the report, right? So you have 11 licensed settlement quarries that are producing between 10 and 12 million tons of stone a year for the Israeli market, making up roughly a quarter of the Israeli stone market. This is in itself a violation of international law, but we'll put that aside. At the same time, it's Israeli policy not to allow for Palestinian quarries in Area C, which most of the quarryable land is located there. And because of that, many Palestinian quarries have either shut down or are working at very, very partial capacity. I spoke to a number of Palestinian quarry owners who only operate on Shabbat, on weekends, because that's when the Israeli military is less likely to come and confiscate their equipment. And so I spoke, for example, to one Palestinian quarry owner who said he used to employ 10 Palestinians in his quarry, and now he sometimes borrows a tractor and works alone, not a tractor or whatever it's called, it's called. But obviously is not able to employ people. At the same time, I spoke to a Palestinian working in a settlement, chiseling the stone that was coming from the settlement quarry, ironically to make it look like it's an old Arab house. Getting none of the required minimum wage or other labor rights. But again, putting that aside. So here, this is a very clear example of this particular Palestinian being dependent on a job in settlements, that being sort of marketed as a benefit that the settlement business is giving to Palestinians, where the bigger issue is the fact that he can't get a job in the Palestinian stone industry because Israel does not allow it to develop. And so this is really how what we're trying to do with this report is shift the focus and look at the underlying context in which settlement businesses operate. The labor issues are very real, but and there's a chapter in the report on them, but we don't like to focus on them because it misses the larger point, which is that the dependence of Palestinians on the Israeli Israeli jobs is something that's cultivated by Israel, and that's actually a problem for the Palestinian economy, and that it's a direct result of the inability for the Palestinian economy to develop under Israeli restrictions.
Can I just ask back to what the judge said? What were the Palestinians doing between 1948 and 67? Were they working? Was there the economy there? I don't remember.
They're mostly heavily relying on many Palestinians in that area were farmers. This has been, obviously, the farming, the reliance on agriculture has greatly diminished because of the land and water policies in West Bank. I'm not an expert on this issue. I don't know if you have more information, but
clearly it was agriculture beforehand. Those statistics exist. This is not. It wasn't a highly developed economy. It wasn't a highly developed area. Neither was Israel at that time. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago when I first came up with SodaStream, which I called SodaStream, Saadoun, and the myth of benevolent occupation. After I've been doing this for almost 20 years, I find it fascinating to suddenly hear Israelis and American Jews so profoundly committed to jobs for Palestinians. Because I haven't encountered that before. I can't speak to whether, I won't speak to whether or not I think there was a deliberate policy of the Israeli government with settlements to make Palestinians dependent on a settlement economy. I think that may just be a byproduct. I mean, that analysis is Sarah's, and that's great. Regardless, Israel did not develop the settlements as a favor for the Palestinians. If it's a byproduct, it's a byproduct that comes at the cost of the ability of the Palestinians to develop their own economy. When SodaStream closed and they say, well, now Palestinians will have to drive 5 hours from Ramallah to get to Hebron, straight shot from Ramallah to Hebron should be half an hour, 45 minutes maximum in rush hour traffic. That problem there is not that SodaStream closed. The problem is that we have settlements. Even if you say, well, there's no one to negotiate with, there's no government. So fine, military occupation gives Israel the right to secure the land, to protect its borders, an absolute right to self-defense. What's keeping Palestinians from getting from Ramallah to Hebron to work is not military on the borders of the Green Line. It's that the area between it is dotted with settlements, with infrastructure serving settlements, and with checkpoints preventing movements of the settlements are controlling land with quarries and industrial zones and all of that. If American Jews and Israeli Jews are so concerned about the economy of the Palestinians, which I believe they should be, because a stable Palestine next to Israel requires a Palestinian economy that is healthy and self-sustaining without jobs inside Israel, without jobs in settlements, the answer isn't, well, for goodness sake, let's protect settlement enterprises so they have jobs. The answer is, let's end the occupation, and then, imagine someday an industrial zone in the Malaysia area where you have joint Israeli settlement projects. You worked on the Gaza stuff. This is not fantasy. If you have a political agreement, there is more bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to work together and to be successful in coexistence than there is keeping them apart.
If I can add one more. Because you used the word coexistence, a particular pet peeve of mine is when people use that word about settlement jobs. I mean, it's one thing to argue, what about the harm caused if settlement businesses leave to Palestinian workers? But I find it's so troubling when people use the word coexistence about settlement jobs, because what it does is it says, the ideal, the end game, right, where we hold up something as successful coexistence is one in which all of the privileges and access to ownership is reserved for one people, and then you have low-wage jobs for the other, and that's the best we're gonna get.
Thank you, and actually I thought it was an excellent report from a legal perspective, from a factual perspective. With respect to the settlement issue, it does reflect the international consensus position. As you said, the International Court of Justice said settlements were illegal. The UN Security Council said on numerous occasions settlements are illegal. The International Committee for the Red Cross says that. Practically every single human rights organization, practically every country in the world, there's very few, if any, saying otherwise. And so I'm glad that was reflected in the report. Actually, there's a State Department opinion. She referenced an earlier one, but the standing position from 1977 is also that settlements are illegal. Maybe the political wing of the U.S. government, for other reasons, takes different positions. But even the United States signed on to those UN Security Council resolutions in the past, at least a half dozen of them that passed, that say that there's an occupation, that the settlements are illegal under the 14th.
I would add is the fact that the Israelis continue to hold Palestinians under military law. Yeah. Just like in any case that the Israelis believe it's under military occupation.
But my question is about the recommendations, and I guess my concern is that, you're laying out, there are hundreds of thousands of settlers in the West Bank, and there's billions of dollars of industry, and this institutionalized discrimination. But then when it comes to, okay, well, what do we do about it? I think the report almost falls off. It's like, well, best business practices for human rights. So, we hope that businesses will adopt that. Is that really, given the magnitude of the situation, talking about war crimes under the 14th Convention, and then you saying that businesses, this is not like some tech startup, recommendation. This is like a serious, central issue to the conflict. Is that really, do the recommendations go far enough for this report?
Well, these are the recommendations in the context of businesses. We have, other recommendations for other reports related to settlements. And that's that's sadly kind of what's available under human rights law. You have standards which businesses have a responsibility to comply. But we also have other recommendations. For example, that states have the Fourth Geneva Convention includes an obligation on states to ensure respect for the convention. And so states also have duties not to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank and not to aid and abet unlawful violations of the Fourth Geneva Convention. For this reason, we call on states, and this particularly applies to the United States, not to indirectly subsidize settlements by basically deducting the amount that Israel spends on settlements from any contribution it makes. So that's another sort of tool we have under international law, but we do limit the recommendations to to laws and standards. And I would add that we do so very, very conservatively. I mean, I think that you're correct. It might seem strange to say this in light of the previous questions, but we are actually on the very, very conservative side of international law here. We do that intentionally. We really try to stay on ground that is very, very firm. So, for example, the question of whether or not states should ban the import of settlement goods. I mean, there is a legal position that says that if states have a duty not to aid and abet violations of the 14th Convention, and settlement goods are, helping to sustain settlements, then shouldn't states prohibit their import? And we felt that this was not a settled enough piece of law to make that recommendation. If states want to do that, then that's their prerogative. But we really try to stay on the conservative side because of the sensitivities around this issue.
Dan Lieberman, Riot. You've talked about illegal and unlawful. What I haven't heard is penalties and enforcement. It seems to be a sort of a gulf between what are illegal and criminal activity and what is being done about them. Now, who would be responsible to provide the penalties and enforcement other than the Security Council, which has seen the U.S. veto? Who do you go to penalize or enforce the laws and regulations you're talking about?
With respect to settlement activity more
All
broadly?
of it.
Well, I mean, the International Criminal Court now has jurisdiction over violations of the Rome Statute in or from the state of Palestine. And so,
Have they heard anything?
I'm sorry?
Have they heard anything?
So they are currently conducting a preliminary examination, which is standard practice when a country accedes to the Rome Statute, and it's like kind of slowly making its way through the initial preliminary examination stage to determine whether or not there are crimes that might fall under the jurisdiction of the court. If the determination is that there are, then the court would then open an investigation. But the transfer of civilians of occupying power into occupied territory is a violation of the Rome Statute. So presumably, this issue would be a focus of the ICC examination.
Just an observation. I don't think anyone expects this to be settled by legal proceedings. Anyway, what the value of this is, I think, for a lot of us who work on this issue, is really casting a bright light on what's going on. Because at this point, we are losing, for the foreseeable future, it seems, the possibility of ending this conflict based on negotiations. And it's not going to be resolved any other way but negotiations. And we are essentially at this moment where this light on it is saying to people, you have to do something. If you look back on the history, I did a survey recently. I get really interested. I try to take the facts first and then have a thesis evolve from the facts, not the other way around. It's very un-Washington. And I looked at Security Council resolutions critical of Israel across the span of time. And what you find, Security Council resolutions peak, setting aside Obama, what we've had none, they peak when things are going badly. The low point, the sort of ebb since '67, before Obama, all of this, because under Obama, again, nothing. But before Obama, the ebb, when there were the fewest Security Council resolutions in any way critical of Israel, was during the Clinton administration, during the peace years. Because when it looks like we have a prospect for actually resolving this politically, and negotiations are offering us a way out, people, this stuff doesn't happen. Because everyone knows this isn't going to resolve it. This is going to create more anger, more frustration, it's going to get more people riled up, but it actually isn't going to resolve the conflict. The ICC isn't going to resolve it. Jordan taking the barrier to the ICJ doesn't resolve it. The court case now that has been filed against the settlements in Sheldon Adelson isn't going to resolve this. It's almost, you can call it background noise. But at this point, I think it's useful to pay attention to this background noise. This is coming to a peak now because we are coming to the 8th year of the most right-wing governments in Israel's history, pro-Settlement right-wing, of a PA that has no ability to show us another way forward and to stand up. And at that point, all of this really comes to a head. This will resolve not through court cases, it will resolve through a political process. I would hope that this, as it concerns people, because you don't want to see this dragged to the ICC, I don't want to see Israel dragged to the ICC. But what's going to prevent it is not Israel launching a full court press internationally. What's going to prevent it is actually putting out a hand with something serious to move forward on a peace negotiation.
I think that the issue of accountability is, I mean, I take your point, but I think it's more than kind of background noise. I think it serves a very, very important role. I mean, negotiations don't happen in a vacuum. They happen, the calculation, the interests of both sides change based on what's happening around. And that although the intention of this report is not to kind of create a pressure in order to achieve particular political outcomes, certainly by holding people accountable, or the threat of holding people accountable, by creating penalties for businesses that are operating, even if it's just reputational and therefore impacting their bottom line. Perhaps that will make businesses less likely to operate there, make the settlements less economically viable, raise the cost of settlements on Israel. These things, the way in which all of these different issues play out affects the interests, which then feed into negotiations.
Absolutely.
So I think that the accountability and the kind of teeth aspect, which is the part which is historically missing from this whole kind of attempt to resolve the conflict more broadly, but from my perspective, the abuses happening within the context of the occupation, is a very serious missing piece, and it's part of the reason why we are about to enter the 50th year of the occupation.
Absolutely.
So my question, I guess, has to do with the involvement of the Israeli government with basically supporting such businesses. My name is Izzy Licht, and I'm in charge of the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I guess, if I remember correctly, is that Saadoun has been talking a lot about basically the net, much more money is flowing into settlements from the Israeli government than they're getting out in taxes. Right. And so basically, how is this connection between the amount of Israeli federal investment, basically, or national investment into the settlements impacting the businesses that are working there? Is it making them more entrenched? Is it making those businesses more viable? Do they rely on government contracts or government subsidies in a way that basically connects the Israeli government policy even more so to these settlement businesses?
Yes, one of the sections in the report covers national priority areas, which is a designation that Israel uses anywhere in Israel, also in settlements, to kind of help immigration to an area by offering a range of government subsidies. And so Israel has designated 90 settlements as national priority areas. And so including almost all of the 20 industrial zones, settlement industrial zones. And so businesses do receive benefits, not all, but many businesses, operating in settlements receive these benefits. So the question of whether or not the settlements cost money for the Israeli taxpayer or whether or not they're a source of income for Israel is kind of interesting, one that people argue about. Some people like to use the argument that it's actually very expensive for Israel to maintain the settlements in order to argue against them. Others try to argue that actually this is a case of holding on to territory for economic reasons. I think that actually both are true. Settlements are expensive for Israel. They require, even providing education and healthcare is more expensive because of the way in which the population distribution is set up. Obviously, the security is much more expensive. In addition to these subsidies, the settlements are also very profitable for particular companies, and so it's a bit of case of socializing the costs, but privatizing the profits. In other respects, the West Bank is economically important to the state more broadly, specifically around water. Use of water originating in the West Bank. Yeah.
We have time for one more, if anyone.
I want to comment about the water situation. I mean, there's an aquifer under the West Bank, but Israel has solved the water problem. I don't think they use it, but not much. Through desalinization, you can get all the water you want. They brought the price down. They, in fact, supplying water to Jordan. And of course, they supply all the water that goes to Gaza. They've got some tremendous problems over there in the water and other things. So I don't know about the water. And in your opening comments, maybe I missed some, you talked about all the natural resources in the West Bank. It's a stone quarry, the whole place. There's no oil, there's no gas, there's nothing there. Except the lousy agricultural land, which I worked on years ago with the extension service there. So I to improve the agriculture of the West Bank. And so there was some improvement, but water was a major concern. But it's not really a problem the way I think we were stating it.
First of all, when I say natural resources, actually land is the most important, and it's not necessarily in terms of the economic, because you can, exploit it to make lots and lots of money. It's because people actually need it to live on and for their livelihoods and to build factories. I mean, it's a much more kind of elementary aspect of needing actual land to build a Palestinian economy. With respect to water, so one of the major aquifers is in a heavily settled, let's say, area between Ariel and the Green Line. What Israel does is it draws from this aquifer on the Israeli side of the Green Line, but it protects the aquifer itself from, it ensures that it prevents Palestinians from drawing from this aquifer through the placing settlements there. So, and this is kind of part of the problem of when you look at kind of agreements that have seemingly very high percentages of land that's being offered to Palestinians. One of the areas of land that's considered to kind of, under any agreement, be part of Israel, actually would protect this aquifer, would prevent Palestinians from this aquifer. But when I talk about the water problem, it's that on average settlers use 6 times the amount of water as Palestinians. Around 10,000 settlers in the Jordan Valley have access to, I'm forgetting the exact percentage, but like roughly I think a quarter of the amount of water as all the Palestinians in the West Bank. And so the problem is that farmers don't have access to sufficient water to irrigate their lands, whereas whereas Israeli settlers are, farming water-intensive fields with this water, and so it's a very serious problem for the Palestinian economy.
Are there in fact Israeli farmers in the West Bank?
I'm sorry?
Israeli farmers in the West Bank?
Yes, the Jordan Valley. It's also a way of claiming huge areas of land.
But most of the land is still in Palestinian hands. 90% of it is from what you showed in the West Bank. Most of it is still in
all of the green is under exclusive Israeli control. These gray areas under Palestinian Authority administrative control. So the Palestinian control is basically limited to these islands. There are actually 227 of them throughout the West Bank. But this area here is heavily farmed by settlers.
And Sarah made reference to the comments from Secretary of State Kerry at the Saadoun Forum about the trend actually being in the wrong direction, and that it's not, there isn't more control being accrued to Palestinians, the Israelis are actually taking more control. We have one more question here, and then we'll close.
I'm Peter Hawley, a citizen active on these issues through the Episcopal Church, and I commend Human Rights Watch for the report. I look forward to reading it. I'm just curious to know what each of your organizations, what next steps you may be planning to take to get this.
Can you make it a little louder? I can't hear that question.
I just want to find out what each organization is thinking of doing to get this report out across the country. It seems like very valuable information.
Well, speaking for us, events like this, pushing it out through our own networks, doing whatever we can to put this in front of journalists, people here on the Hill, policy analysts. Lara?
Look, I mean, we're sharing it. We have our own reports. Peace Now has Settlement Watch inside Israel. This is not, we stay in our lane. This is not our lane. We are not legal experts. We are not, this is their research. It's great, and I'm encouraging folks to look at it. And I think it's really good. We have our own body of research that we point people to, www.peacenow.org and www.peacenow.org.il for the Israeli site with research in Hebrew and in English.
Yeah, I would say this is a great report, obviously, but Lara's work and APN's work is really some of the best you will find, most comprehensive. Our website, fmht.org, also has a huge library of work that's been done on settlements and contemporary analysis as well. Thank you. Well, thank you again all for taking